Hey everyone, my name is Balint and I'm a European indie game developer who is working on a live service game called Tales of Tirunia. I figured I would react to the Stop Killing Games initiative as Ross has dropped another video about the end of the initiative, and I think it makes sense for us to just go through and talk about some of the things that were said, not the drama part, but like the technicalities, specifically related to development and how they may affect, developers all over the world. I am an indie dev. I'm also a gamer. I always have been a gamer. Like I was 2 years old. I was sitting on my father's lap and he was playing Doom and I would yell when his HP got low. I've been around this block a lot. So games mean a lot to me. So if you haven't seen the new video, it's called The End of Stop Killing Games. This is not the video that I'm going to react to, but I wanted to show it here just in case you guys want to take a look. Let's hear for the first few seconds.
This is probably the final update to the Stop Killing Games campaign. Though I'm coming at you
Yeah. So in this video, to be fair, Ross goes through all the things that he's done for this initiative and saying that he's not going to touch it anymore. I, understand that. It's definitely been draining on him. And it's not a easy topic, especially in a industry like game development, which is very much fueled by passion. And a lot of people will just take sides and throw crap at each other. So I just want to say thank you to Ross for pushing this initiative as far as he could. For the record, I'm from Hungary and I signed the initiative. So there's that. That's my bias towards it. But what I wanted to go through is sort of Thor's or Pirate Software, you might know him as that, arguments against the whole thing, and I want to give you my thoughts on and rationale on what that means, from my perspective as a developer working on a live service game. So in this section, he's talking about server binaries and giving that to users after end of life and the risks that are included in that. Let's hear it.
The reason why is because it leaves developers open to abuse. So let's explore that a little bit. Let's say that you made your own video game and you made a live service game. Maybe it's an MMO, maybe it's something else, right? And let's say that I want to monetize that game, but you don't allow monetization of the game by any other party. This makes sense because most creators don't allow for that. You can't just take someone else's art and profit off of it. Normal, right? So then I go, well, how am I going to force you to do this? Under this initiative, you would have to release the server binaries or keep the game in a functional, playable state at end of life.
Okay, so small correction here. You wouldn't necessarily have to release the server binaries, just need to come up with an end-of-life plan that allows players to continue playing the game, right? And there are multiple ways you can achieve that. One of them is releasing the server binaries. Another one is keeping the game in a functional state. And we can talk about sort of how that's possible, I guess, later on in this video. But there's also maybe open sourcing your code. And all of these have risks associated with them, pros and cons as well, right? For example, giving a server binary is not as simple as you might think. Most games run on a Linux server when it comes to like a server client model. Building that for Windows, which is the majority of players' operating system, is not straightforward at all. So it's, it can be a lot of extra work actually to get there. Open sourcing your code, of course, opens you up to licensing issues and maybe your IP getting, exposed, stolen, whatever. So there's, again, a lot of extra things there that you need to do. But, I mean, at the end of the day, all of this is for the consumer. And so if you're building a game and you're designing from the get-go with the consumers in mind or the players in mind, these are things that you can work around. It's not easy. I'm not going to say that it's easy, but, we had very similar things happening with GDPR in the EU, where there was the initiative for data protection, and all of the companies actually had to do a lot of work to catch up to those initiatives and laws at the end of the day, or regulations.
So I hit you with a ton of bots. I hit you with a ton of exploits. I attack your community. I destroy your Reddit. I go after your business. I go everywhere that I possibly can to make this cost as much as it possibly can for you. And it's not hard to do this. We saw the exact same thing happen in TF2 recently. The massive amount of bots that were attacking the game. This is not...
Yeah, so, I mean, but these are things that you would have to negate against anyways, and it's not an easy topic. So for bots, right, you have to do some bot detection, which in itself is pretty hard. Unless you have a lot of data on how your players play the game naturally. It's not simple to detect bots, especially because that happens on the client side. So when you have a client-server authoritative model, what ends up happening is the server acts as sort of like a judge. If you think about like a tennis game, right? There are two players and there's a judge or a referee. And if something goes wrong, the referee can say, hey, that was like an illegal move. You cannot do that, whatever. That's what the server does. But when someone is botting, that is happening all on the client side. And what they do essentially is they just simulate the moves of a normal player. Now, because they are bots, they typically work on some sort of logic. For example, every few milliseconds do this. But then there is also things like, the bot developers will put in jitters so that it's not so straightforward that the bot is moving. So you have to do a lot of things there to make sure that you can handle the bot detection, and it's not an easy thing at all. But you would have to do that anyway in a multiplayer game because, you don't want bots. So that's something that you already put effort into. For exploits, again, in a client-server authoritative model, it's not perfect. Of course, if you have a lot of developers working on a game, there will be things where, exploits slip through the cracks. But again, this is something that's called like a security-first mindset when you're developing something. In the business world, you have to actually do that all the time. You have to be very careful and cautious about exploits, right? You should be in games as well. Now, granted, games are much, much more complex than most software out there, business software out there. So, you have to take into account a lot more things, but it's not necessarily something that you cannot do. If you look at things like League of Legends and Teamfight Tactics, yes, there are exploits, but, typically there aren't that many of them, and the company is actively working on diminishing all of those possibilities. And for the community destruction, yeah, especially with the LLM era, right? This is becoming more and more of an issue. You can just put in a bunch of sort of LLMs that will argue the community and destroy it as much as possible. Yeah, that's a tough one. I don't really know how to deal with that yet. Sometimes you can easily figure out if something is an LLM or not, but other times it's actually very hard if the LLM is tweaked correctly. So these are actually valid risks, right? We need to take into account, and they add a bunch of extra things that you would need to watch out for when you're developing the game.
Not infeasible. This is something that is very easily attainable today. And let's say that this goes on long enough that your game dies because you can't afford it anymore, and your studio has to shut down. At end of life, you now have to release those server binaries to keep the game in a functional, playable state. At which point I take those, I create a private server, and I monetize it. And some people have said, well, simply don't allow monetization of the server. Well, who's going to enforce that? If you want a government initiative to enforce that, that means the government has to build a registry of all of those games and all of that intellectual property that shouldn't be monetized, and then somehow enforce that with no one owning it because those studios have shut down. That's going to be a massive burden. On top of that, if you want to go the other route and say the company has to go and control it, well, what if the company's not around anymore? Is that just able to be monetized now? Again, this was obtained through...
Yeah, so, again, good point to argue, I think. But you have to keep in mind that, yes, this is attainable already today. So government, I don't think, should enforce this at all. It should be enforced by the companies. And he says, what if the company is not around anymore? Well, then who cares if your thing was monetized and taken, in my opinion. If you have dissolved your company, then you're pretty much just saying goodbye to your IP anyway. So it is what it is, right? I think that should become part of the public domain at that point in time. But if you're still around, and if you don't want this to happen, well, the MCA strike the other party, which, it works in the Western world, to be fair. If someone from Russia or China does this, you're pretty much screwed. But again, targeting those markets is already harder. And so maybe what you will have to deal with is just taking I'm not going to get onto that side of the globe because I just can't feasibly do. There is already a lot of players in the Western world who I can target. Let's go with them. But again, this is actually a very good point, I think, from him.
Abuse of the original creator. I don't think that's a good route. And this scenario gets even worse if you do allow monetization, because now I can just kill off your company and then monetize the server and no one will ever come after me. Now it's even more of a problem. So allowing monetization of this work is strictly worse. And for those of you...
Yeah. So again, I don't like it's. If you allow monetization, I think it can still be fine, but that's a decision that you would have to make as a company at the end of the day.
You out there that say, "Oh, this can be done right now. I could just destroy your studio and take your stuff anyway." You could, but this allows a route for it to be legal to do so. That's
okay. So I think he meant to say this allows for it a way to be easier to do that. It's still not going to be legal just because you have an end-of-life plan. Targeting and exploiting another business is illegal, and you can actually sue other people for doing that. Just FYI.
The problem. After putting this out publicly and talking to people about it, this specific scenario on both YouTube and Discord and Reddit and a bunch of other locations, I got a couple of takes back. We're going to start with the most extreme position and kind of go from there. So in the most extreme, people said live service games shouldn't exist at all, and the initiative will kill them off for good, and that's a good thing. Well, you don't get to define what players get to play or not.
Yeah, I don't agree with that take at all from people who say that, right? Live service games should be around, and they could be good, as long as you keep your players in mind. I think most people have an issue with live service games that are done by AAA studios who will just like milk you for all the money that you have by not only having a huge price tag on the base game, but then they will have like loot boxes and microtransactions polluting the whole game. For example, with Tales of Tirunia, what I'm doing is there's just like, it's a free-to-play game and a live service game, but I want to be as transparent as possible, right? There are no loot boxes, no pay-to-win ever. There's going to be clear pricing on premium items, so no like second currency that you buy the cosmetic with. You just like have the actual price of the cosmetic right there, $5, whatever. And then everything else you can trade on the Steam marketplace. That's a non-unique item. But I think arguing that live service games should go away is just not correct at all from whoever is doing that.
Not play. You also shouldn't be able to get to define what developers build or don't build. You should not have creative control over the developers, and you should not have control over what is in my Steam library or on my phone.
Yeah.
That doesn't make any goddamn sense. Aside from that, the initiative does not purport to kill live service games. It would just make it incredibly difficult to build said games and add a lot of risk to it, which is why...
Yeah, I mean, this is true, right? Like, it would add a lot of risk to building a live service game, as we discussed before, and it would also make it harder. But as with anything, it will take time for businesses to catch up, and they would start offering solutions that would be compliant with this new law. The same thing that we did with GDPR. I mean, if you are an EU-based developer, you know, from 2016 or so, whenever that was introduced, just how much time you had to spend on figuring out how to deal with GDPR. It was part of business. It is what it is. You just have to take it.
Why I'm bringing all of this up and why I don't support the initiative in the first place. A lot of people don't realize that this will slowly diminish live service games in the market because it's not an incentive for us to build them anymore.
So yeah, it might mean that there would be fewer live service games, but that isn't necessarily a bad thing, right? Like, I think the live service games that would make it to the market would actually be higher quality. So that's where I'm at with this one. And I think that's enough for this segment. Let's jump on to the next one, which is about the preservation of games as the second argument.
One is that this is about games preservation and that it needs to happen to preserve these types of games for future generations and for everyone to always have forever. But I would argue that this isn't actually preserving these games. Social games, such as, let's say, Apex Legends, require a number of players to be in the match at the same time so that you can have an experience that is only able to be obtained through lots of players interacting, right? It's a multiplayer game. You need a bunch of people. How many of you have felt negatively when an MMO dies or when a live service game dies? Oh, dead game. There's only 5 people online. Why would I play that? So why would you want to preserve a game in that state? That doesn't make any sense to me. You want to take down these live service games, put them up on a private server, and then play it with a couple of people. You're not bringing it back at its height. You're not taking a snapshot of what the game actually is. You're making it limp on in a way that doesn't make any sense.
Okay, so there are a few things to unpack here, right? And we need to distinguish between MMORPGs and other multiplayer games, in my opinion, or not even necessarily MMORPGs, but like games that rely on having a in-game economy that is driven by a lot of people interacting with the game. So first off, I can very much see a use case where there's a multiplayer game that would be played by, you know, a bunch of people still, and by say a bunch, meaning like 50 or 100 people around the world who are very devoted to that game. They could even play, you know, tournaments against each other and whatever, which I think is a good reason to have the game in a functional state so that those people can still play it without, you know, costing you any money. Just let them enjoy the game, let them have their fun. I think that's perfectly fine. With MMOs and games with sort of open economies, is a little bit harder because you are not getting the full experience, and it might not make that much of a sense to keep those games around. But, you know, if you really want to play with 5 of your friends, I guess you could, but I don't see a reason why people would really want to do that. But that's just my opinion. Maybe you have a different opinion. Leave a comment down below if you do.
It's not preservation. And for those that may stop there and go, but private servers going to have a lot of players. Look at all the ones for World of Warcraft. Again, we talked about that. It opens up a route for abuse of the developers. So that is not a solution. And the last thing.
Yeah, I just don't agree with this take. I mean, you already are open to abuse, and I understand that he would think that it makes abuse easier, but it's your job as a entity to protect yourself from these kind of things. So if you don't, then, you know, maybe you shouldn't be in business. That's a harsh take, I know, but it is what it is. And if my game gets killed by this, you know, I will still say the same things. I just messed up in that case. Okay, so that's that. And then the next one is where he got criticism for criticizing the wording of this being too vague.
The last take that I got from this is, and it's the most reasonable to me, this is an initiative. It's not a law. Why are you upset? Just wait. I'm not going to wait. And the reason I'm not going to wait is because I see the start of this conversation not making sense. It's not including the actual developer side of the conversation. It's not showing the trials and problems that this could arise inside of the gaming industry for people who are actually making the games you play. I don't.
Yeah. So here's the thing. I very much agree with him on this one, as much as it sounds bad. So here's the thing. You know, we have come a long way since the era of the internet. And we have this divide between different groups now. There's always A versus B. And everyone just wants to shout their thoughts instead of having a conversation. Now, to be fair, Ross did reach out to Thor, and he wanted to talk about these things, and Thor declined. So, you know, he's as guilty as he's saying others are in this situation, in my opinion. But what we should have is a conversation between gamers and game devs. Game devs should be striving to build games that are enjoyed by the players, and players should understand that building games is not an easy task. It requires a lot of thought, but we can come together and build something together that works fine. That's my opinion. So I think that's it for this one. And then the last point that he had was sort of the marketing around purchasing a game versus a license. So let's take a look at that.
With all of that being said, I do think there's a consumer protection thing that we can fix here. It's just not really what the initiative is about. I think that if you're going to buy a live service game, you shouldn't be told you're buying the game. You shouldn't be told that you're purchasing the game. You should be told explicitly that you are purchasing a license to that game. The reason why is because that license needs to be revoked anytime that you are cheating at the game and damaging the play experience of other players. While this is written in the TOS and the EULA, it's usually not clearly defined at point of sale. Or they throw a giant TOS in front of you and it doesn't really do anything because people skip past it. If at point of sale it says specifically, there's specific language stating that you are either leasing or purchasing a license or anything along those lines, that you're not actually buying the game directly, I think it would go a long way to informing consumers of what they're doing and protect them from some of these business practices that they didn't realize they were engaging in. That makes a lot more sense to me than...
Yeah, I think that makes sense, right? And it's something that I'm not doing yet either, although the game is not yet available for the public. It's in development, but I think I will actually put this up either on the Steam page or somewhere, or even the web page, where you can just see that you're purchasing a license to the game. You're not purchasing the game itself. And again, he's right. I need to do that because I need to be able to revoke your license in case you're cheating in the game in some shape or form. Now, That means, if I were to sunset my game and go through my sunset policy, which let's take a look at that. So for example, my sunset policy here is I'm going to open source the game, both the client and the server, in case I need to shut down for whatever reason my servers. I'll give you comprehensive documentation on how to set up your server so you can run it. And then you will also have like a player data migration tool where you can transfer your data from my servers to another server of your choice, so that you can continue where you left off, right? So in that case, as someone who cannot join my server anymore because you were banned, in case I have to shut down my own servers and someone else starts to run their own server, then you will be able to join that, and you will have another license with that server or like that operator, I guess, at that point in time. So there's that. But yeah, licenses are a good thing in this case, even if it means you don't actually own the game itself. This is, whether you believe it or not, it's in your protection as well to have that license in place. So I think that's that pretty much. And I had one more thing here with Charlie. Oh yeah, let's take a look at him. I don't remember. Oh yeah, it was about. Let's just hear it out.
And the more I think about it, like the more nonsensical it becomes, because even in Pirate Software's hypothetical fanfic there, why would the developers need to rebalance the game? They would just turn over the code to the community and just it'd be in that state. They're no longer responsible for balancing the game. That's the whole point. They're not indefinitely supporting it. They would just be responsible of leaving the game in an accessible state to the community while they would shut down the servers on their end. Like they wouldn't.
Yeah. So he was here reacting to Thor's previous claim where he would for some reason claim that the initiative is about turning multiplayer online games into single player at the end of life, which is just not true. So that's why I didn't react to that, because it was arguing a straw man, in my opinion. But that's fine. So here, yeah, Charlie is saying, the developers wouldn't have to do that at all. They just have to turn over the code or the binaries to the community, which is exactly what I will do, by the way. But I wanted to, highlight it here as well. Again, turning over binaries is not necessarily that simple. I think open sourcing your code is a little bit simpler, but there are gotchas with that as well. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about this one, right? When you open source your client, let's say you're an indie dev like me and you're building your thing in Unity or even Unreal or whatever else engine, it's very likely that you will end up using third-party assets for some parts of your game because it just makes sense. You don't necessarily want to build everything from scratch, because in that case, everything would take like 10 years to develop instead of 1 or 2 years. So I'll give you an example. I'm using this asset, which is called GrassFlow in my game for grass, right? But if I were to open source my client, I would very likely have to either remove this asset from it, so the game wouldn't actually have all the grass elements in that, which might be fine. It would look a little bit worse. Or I would have to actually develop my very own grass shader at that point in time and use that instead. Or I would have to come to an agreement with the developers of this asset to say, hey, I'm sunsetting and open sourcing my game. Are you okay with having your code in there? And so the reason is because once you download this asset, the code is essentially there in your project, right? So you would, if you were to open source the client, you would actually open source this project as well with it. So you can see the issues with that. And then the same goes for stuff like in your server side, you might not want to deal with everything yourself. You might want to use an authentication service that is a third party that you pay money for, right? You have a contract with them. And when you open source your server binary or server code, that means that now the other person who's going to run that server will have to have the same contract with that same provider, or they won't be able to actually host the service without having to meaningfully change and alter the code. So there are things that you would have to take into account. So for example, my whole game server runs on AWS. Everything is AWS integrated. So whoever were to run the servers themselves would have to have an AWS account, and they would have to pay for any fees for running those servers. Now, because I'm in the fortunate situation that I'm working on a turn-based game, it means that I can get away with zero cost for up until like 100,000 users pretty much. Actually, that's not true. 10,000 is more likely. At 100,000 active users, my cost would be around 200 USD per month, right? But up to like 10,000, it's pretty much free to run everything. Sorry about the Brave notification there. But that's not necessarily the case with other games, especially ones that require real time, processing and real-time communication between client and server, because there you cannot really use a pay-as-you-go serverless model. You actually have to have an idle instance running 24/7 for which you have to pay. So there are things like that you have to keep in mind, right? But it is what it is, and we will see how this shapes as we go forward. Now, though I just said that for games that require real-time communication, you actually have to have an idle instance. I did come up with a game server architecture back in 2021, which is an on-demand game server architecture. What it does is, instead of having idle instances run that you have to pay for, there is a serverless pay-as-you-go API, which when you ask it, it will actually bring up an instance for the duration of the game itself. So this is good for games where, not for MMOs, but it's good for games like Path of Exile, for example, where you have to go into an instance, play that instance, get out. And for the duration of that instance, or like map, or whatever you want to call it, you would have a game server that's running. So there are ways you can do this, but again, you have to actually take this into account. And if you were to open source a game server architecture like this, anyone could run it without much of a cost. And you would still have the option to not just run this on demand, but have idling instances still if you want to serve some of the requests faster. Whatever. Like, there are ways to go about this, is what I'm trying to say. So yeah, I think that's that. I think, we should be having a conversation instead of throwing and flinging shit at each other, I'll be honest. I think gamers and game devs need to come together. I hope that we can do that at some point in time. And I do think that, big studios or big publishers are very different from indies. So I am very much biased towards smaller developers and smaller studios. I am one of those myself. And that's it. I hope you enjoyed. If you have any thoughts, I would love to hear them. I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.